A couple of announcements before we go any further. The first of these is that to my right you can see a box, and on the front of the box it says question time, and in this box are all the questions that the panel, which will consist of Jack Windsor-Lewis, John Wells, James Setter and various other important people, are going to answer on Friday morning in the final session. I will now turn the box upside down and you will see that so far question time is going to be silent time. So if you've got any questions about any aspect of the teaching of pronunciation or phonetics, or even questions about other things, well, not anything. How can I've got this problem with my boyfriend. But questions relative to the course, please put them in there. The second thing is we are very, very honoured today in that this afternoon we have a special talk by Eva, who is an ex-colleague of mine and now working in Spain. Eva's written a terrific book, which you're going to hear a lot about in the future, called Teach Yourself English Pronunciation. Eva, will you just stand up and... Okay, it's that person going, no, I'm not going to stand up, is Eva. This is her book. We've had a quick look through it. It's only just out. Is it published already? Okay, so there you go. She's giving a talk this afternoon, and basically, you should all go along. Okay, so let's begin. The next three lectures involve a slight change in focus. Michael mentioned in yesterday's lecture that so far all of the lectures on intonation have been to do with form. So we've been looking at nuclear tones, about how a nuclear tone affects the tail, about a head, about preheads, all about the form. It is true that Jeff talks a little bit in one of his lectures about the meanings conveyed by intonation, but even then he was concentrating on the forms and looking at how they affected the meanings. The next three talks are going to be from an entirely different perspective. We're going to be starting with notions such as meaning and the functions of intonation, and looking at intonation from the other way around. Now, I hope, at least, that I've been teaching on this course long enough not to be regarded as something of an imposter. But to a certain extent, I always feel I am, slightly. That's because my interest in intonation and in pronunciation generally comes from my studies in pragmatics. So I'm interested in meaning. It's questions such as what is meaning? How does meaning get conveyed that interests me? And as it happens, I've fallen into this kind of little area of study, which means I'm talking and thinking a lot about non-verbal communication and also aspects of prosody. So there are going to be three lectures from me. The first one today, as you can see, is called Functions of Intonation. Now, in your booklet, you've got a handout. There are some variations on that handout from this PowerPoint presentation, though all the numbers should be the same. But either way, you really don't need to listen to me talking and looking at the sheet. Keep the sheet to take away, and we'll try and, I'll try and talk to you, and hopefully you'll pick something up. Also, if anybody has a question at any time in the lecture, I'm quite happy for you to just put your hand up and we'll interact in that way. Okay, so there are three elements of intonation that are essentially relevant to talking about the functions of intonation. And these are all things that you've been looking at in the lectures with Jeff and Michael and various other people. There's tonicity, which is the element of intonation with regards where you locate the intonation. There's tonality, which is how you chunk speech into intonation phrases. And there is tone. So once you've allocated your IPs, once you've decided on the chunks, once you've located the nucleus, then there's the nuclear tone. whether that's going to be a full rise, or any of the other nuclear tones we've thought about. And these elements are kind of relevant to the functions of intonation themselves. So what I want to do first is just show you very broadly what the three main functions are, and talk about which elements of intonation are relevant to those, and then we'll go through the different functions one by one, and I'll show you a few examples of how things work, etc. So the first function is the grammatical function. Intonation functions to help distinguish different grammatical structures and constituents. Tonality is often important here, and tonicity and tone too. Now, English, as you all know, is not one of those languages that uses tone to make lexical contrasts. So speakers of Mandarin and Thai do use tone to distinguish between different morphemes. In English, we don't do that. In fact, even if we've got Norwegian or Swedish speakers here, we've got a Danish speaker, do you use tone in certain positions? Is it obligatory? No. Okay. So, but in some dialects of Norwegian, I was in Norway last year and was surprised, actually, not knowing that much about Norwegian, to hear that certain syllables had to have a certain tone which reflected their grammatical position. That was what it was there for. Now, a couple of things to say about the grammatical function. Because English isn't a tone language, okay, and because we don't even have those obligatory tonal rises and falls that, for example, Norwegian has, you could argue that, you know, the grammatical function is the least important function in English. In fact, in the past I've said it is, and I think lots of other people have said it is too. Having said that, it's important that you realise that doesn't mean you can just forget about it. Because in those rare cases where it is used to make a grammatical distinction, it's absolutely imperative that you get it right. Because if, for example, you say a phrasal verb and put the stress on the wrong part, you can change the meaning of the verb completely. So it's the least important function, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about it, and in fact we will talk about it a little bit. The second one is the focusing function. So this is that element of intonation that directs a hearer to what you intend to be the most salient or relevant parts of a message. Tonicity is particularly important here. As you all know, the nucleus very often is at the end, but if you've got one particular syllable within your IP that you want to stress, which for example is new information, then that's the syllable that will receive the tonic. So the focusing function is very important too, and tonicity is important in carrying out that function. Attitudinal function is the third function. This is the extent to which intonation communicates our attitude to what we're saying, or our attitude to the listener. Tone is particularly important in this function, and key is important too. We'll talk a bit more about key tomorrow, but just a little bit today. Now, in last year's talk on this subject, I included what is sometimes referred to as affective intonation in attitudinal intonation. But I'm actually going to separate them today and say that there is a fourth function which differs from the attitudinal function, and this is the affective function. The reason I want to do this is that there are clearly certain aspects of intonation that are to do with our attitude to what we're saying. So that's the previous one. But there are other elements of intonation which appear to work much more closely with other behaviours that are regarded as non-verbal behaviours. So, facial movements, for example. I tell my class and my ear training groups sometimes, if you're having trouble recognising a fall or a rise, look at the speaker's eyebrows. Okay, I mean, don't pay too much attention to their eyebrows. I think otherwise there might be some sort of strange conflict. But look at their eyebrows. I mean, the amount of people who, when they do a fall, go, no. You know, we call that a bow when we do that. But we call it a fall when we're speaking. But the two things are very, very closely related. Okay? If you say, aha, because you're surprised, the facial expression that accompanies that is a rising of your eyebrows. Aha! So these affective elements of intonation work very closely with other non-verbal behaviours. And it's actually, non-verbal behaviours are kind of really where my research is, what my research is interested in at the moment. So I want to talk about this separately. Okay, so there are 4 functions. There's a grammatical function, the focusing function, the attitudinal function, and the affective function. We're going to go through those one by one. The first one, the grammatical function, and we're going to look at tone and how relevant tone is to the grammatical function. Now, possibly the clearest example of tone affecting grammatical meaning is when we use a rising tone to indicate interrogative mood. So if you want to ask somebody, you know, if they've got a new car, you can just say, new car, new car. That rise indicates that it's a question. And that's just being done by the rise, nothing else. If you say, new car, that communicates something else exactly. You're just commenting, new car. You had another one a few weeks ago, now you've got another one. And if you want to offer somebody a drink, 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 the rise indicates that it's a question. If you walk up to somebody and say, drink, there is a famous comedy show called Father Ted, which is on an Irish comedy show, and one of the characters is a famous kind of alcoholic chap who just sits in the corner, and as soon as anybody walks near him, he just says, drink! With a falling tone, because he's so desperate. Notice, when the question's indicated by the syntax, you don't need that rise. So there is some kind of evidence, at least, that that rise is doing something, that it has to be there because the syntax isn't. So, where do you live? Is a fine way of asking a question. Notice that you can still do rises on WH questions, particularly echo questions. Where do you live? That's a rising tone. So, tone is relevant to grammatical function, but certainly not as relevant as some other languages. Tonicity is, of course, important in making certain linguistic distinctions. This is a takeoff, a plane leaving the ground. One of the worst consequences of the recent kind of tightening of security on airlines is this. This gentleman here, I wouldn't feel confident about you have to take off your shoes, okay? So you've got take off, and before take off you have to, oops, there you go, you have to do that, take off. So let's just practice that very quickly. I know this is an easy distinction for most of you, but take off, and one more time,
take off,
and
take off.
Good. Okay, a few more, just to show my age. My youngest daughter calls these things those big black CDs. And when I showed her how you play these big black CDs, she was absolutely, she couldn't believe it. Couldn't listen. What are these, for those of you who are old enough to remember? Okay, they're records, and here is a state-of-the-art machine. This machine records. So let's try that one more time. Records.
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 Pay attention to the nuclear tone you're using there, because you're all doing it beautifully. Records.
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 Nothing grammatical there, but what are you doing? Why are you arising on records? Why are you saying records? Records. Why are you doing that? Or are you just trying to... Yeah, it's like a list. It's 2 items. You have one, and you indicate that you're going to continue, and you continue. Let's just have a few more. This is a Swedish fishing permit. It's a permit. Everybody? Permit. Permit.
Permit.
Okay? If you have a permit that permits you... Oh. Sorry, this is not my laptop. I don't know what this is, but I'm just going to quit. Probably just downloaded a whole load of viruses onto Michael's laptop now. So let's try permit.
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 Okay. A couple more, and then we'll move on to something else. This is an Andean condor. It is a black bird. Let's try that.
Blackbird.
This is a blackbird.
Blackbird.
The female blackbird is a brown bird. Okay? Some for you to try on your own. What's this thing on the left? That's the White House. What's the thing on the right? Good. What's the thing on the left? It's a greenhouse, and the thing on the right is a... Good. That's a wetsuit. And it is quite astonishing the kind of things you end up searching for on the internet. But I found this strange wedding photo. I would put money that at the end of this photo shoot, he had a wet suit. Okay? Good. So, having looked at those kind of compounds, let's also look at another element of tonicity. This is something I'll probably move through fairly quickly because I know Jeff, I think he was, talked about this a little bit. It's this distinction between vocatives and terms or referring terms being in what we call apposition. So in 6, we have the tonic on friend, and we say, have you met my friend, John? Sorry, have you met my friend, John? Have you met my friend, John? And that would indicate something like, John, have you met my friend? If we divide it up into 2 IPs, we have something more like, have you met my friend, John? Okay, and that would be, have you met my friend whose name is John? Another example, give it to my colleague, Billy. Give it to my colleague, Billy. Give it to my colleague, Billy. Okay, so there's a clear distinction there to be made between referring expressions that are vocatives, so addressing somebody else, and those that are in apposition. Another important aspect of this kind of tonality is relative clauses. And this really is a crucial distinction to make. So if you look at 10, my daughter who lives in London is a student. My daughter who lives in London is a student. Let's compare that with my daughter who lives in Bristol is a dentist. There's a clear difference because in 10, that information who lives in London is identifying the daughter. So he's differentiating between 2 daughters. But in the second one, the stuff about who lives in Bristol is just extra information. So let's, I'll say these once more and then you can practice them for a little bit. The first one is, my daughter who lives in London is a student. Would you try that?
My daughter lives in London.
Okay, what about my daughter who lives in Bristol is a dentist.
My daughter who lives in Bristol is a dentist.
Okay. Now I'll say another sentence. You tell me what the deliberate mistake is with this sentence. My wife who lives in Paris is a teacher. Yeah. If you say, my wife who lives in Paris is a teacher, ... My wife who lives in Turin is a dentist. My wife who lives in, etc., etc., etc. Tonality also helps us to draw the distinction between manner adverbials and sentence adverbials. Now, if you're not sure about the difference between manner adverbials and sentence adverbials, you might well listen to the intonation and you'll hear the difference. Because in the first sentence, the amazingly is going to refer to the behaviour of the daughter. So, my daughter behaved herself amazingly. Okay, she sat in the office for 2 hours while I did some work. My daughter behaved herself amazingly. Notice, if you chunk it slightly differently, then you get something like, my daughter behaved herself amazingly. My daughter behaved herself amazingly. So in the second one, this is very much, you're saying that you have an expression or a feeling of amazement to the fact that your daughter behaved herself. Whereas in the first time, you're just referring to her behaviour. Okay, let's move on to the second function, focusing function. Tonicities, as I mentioned earlier, is terrifically important here because it's the syllable, the particular syllable that you put the tonic on that is often going to be the most important, the most relevant in that word group. It's also known as the accentual function. So you might, if you hear it in, if you see it in another textbook, hear it, see it referred to as the accentual function. That's exactly the same as the focusing function. So let's consider the pronunciation of 16, where if there is a default pronunciation in English, and it's not entirely clear that there is, we generally say that it's on the final content word. The final content word here is 7, then you've got stresses on meet, front, and pub. Meet me in front of the pub at 7. Meet me in front of the pub at 7. Shall we try that? Meet me in front of the pub at 7. Okay, what does Jeff do? 3, 2, 1.
Meet me in front of the pub at 7.
Okay, the only thing about counting is people get much slower, I've noticed. Meet me in front of the pub at 7.
Meet me in front of the pub at 7.
Okay. We've lost a bit of the slide here for some reason. But that doesn't matter because you'll be able to do it anyway. So, having said this, meet me in front of the pub at 7, the person you're talking to says, so I'll see you in front of the cinema at 7. And you reply, no. What do you reply then? Meet me in front of the pub at 7. Try it again.
Meet me in front of the pub at 7.
Ah, so I'll see you in the pub at 7. Okay, let's try and get this in a slightly more organised manner. Okay, so you say to me this, everybody.
Meet me in front of the pub at 7.
Oops. Okay, so I'll see you in front of the cinema at 7.
No, meet me in front of the pub at 7.
Ah, so I'll see you in the pub at 7.
No, meet me in front of the pub at 7.
Okay, so I'll see Bill in front of the pub at 7.
Meet me in front of the pub at 7.
Okay, that's pretty good. I think we should do it one more time just to impress, because we are being filmed here. And, so why don't you say this to me, please? Meet me in front of the pub at 7.
Meet me in front of the pub at 7.
So I'll see you in front of the cinema at 7.
No, meet me in front of the pub at 7.
So I'll see you in the pub at 7.
No, meet me in front of the pub at 7.
So I'll see Bill in front of the pub at 7.
No, meet me in front of the pub at 7.
That's better. I think we can do a bit there, can we? Okay, also focusing function. Very often in class, it occurred to me that we concentrate on these examples where we move the nucleus, but there is also this kind of contrastive stress or contrastive focus, where we actually, the nucleus stays in the same place, but the word changes. So, why don't you buy an old car? Because I want to buy a new car. Why don't you buy an old car? Because I want to buy a new car. Okay, so you can see that the nucleus is in the same place, but you're still contrasting. Okay, so let's go on to the last elements of intonation. These, for me, and you'll probably see as I'm talking about them, are kind of, for me, the most interesting elements of what intonation does. You might see me suddenly become a whole lot more enthusiastic. First of all, notice that I'm going to deal with these two together, attitudinal and affective functions. I'm distinguishing them actually, but I'm going to deal with them together. What I want to show you first is why I think we can make the distinction. So let's look at 22. Let's imagine that you and I are in one of those restaurants that are also very common in London, and we're having a terrible meal. And I say to you, with a particular facial expression and with a particular tone of voice, this meal is delicious. Okay? The words I have uttered have a linguistic meaning. They mean this meal is delicious. You could translate that into your language and have a sentence meaning the same thing. But I, as a speaker, do not mean this meal is delicious. I mean the opposite to that. How do you know I mean the opposite? How do you know? Well, I think it's a lot of things. One of the things is it's the particular tone of voice that you're using. Okay? This meal's delicious is a way of conveying that reasonably high key. If you say it in a very low key, this meal is delicious, accompanied with a particular facial expression and perhaps with a particular mouth movement, what you're essentially communicating is that it's like saying, here are the words, this meal is delicious, but I do not believe them. My attitude to these words is, I distance myself from these words completely. So it's true to say that intonation here has an attitudinal function to what you're saying, because it shows you that you are distancing yourself from what you're saying. You don't believe it. But I think sometimes you can't really use the word attitude to talk about those things. If somebody invites you to come to a party and you say, I'd be delighted to come, I'd be delighted to come, you're happy, okay, you're pleased. That's not really an attitude to what you're saying. That's an attitude, it's just an emotion, it's just a feeling. You're not saying, yes, I am delighted that I am delighted to come. That's not what you mean. You just mean, I'm happy, and you're saying it in a happy way. I couldn't think of another way to do it, but a smiley face is the way we do it on text messages and stuff like that now. So, whilst it's not easy to say where this distinction actually can be drawn, I think we can draw it. There are some cases of attitudinal function and other of affective function. And I think it's an interesting thing to think about to prize them apart, as it were. Now, some people, Patricia, when she gave a lecture on a similar subject, always used to say that these attitudinal or affective elements of intonation are the most important. And it's certainly among the most important. Another thing that some people argue, although this isn't something that Patricia argued, is that this kind of communication of affect and attitude are natural. They're kind of something that are reflected in all of our behaviours somehow. So they're not specifically linguistic at all. Now this is quite a tricky distinction to make, and I'm going to talk more about the distinction between what is linguistic and what is natural tomorrow. But let me give you an example. Here is poor John, who is lost in Piccadilly Circus. He's 7 years old and he's crying. So among those of you who are Japanese or Spanish or from the Basque Country or Danish or whatever else you are, what kind of tone of voice would you use to talk to this child? That's what I want you to think about. We've got lots of different nationalities here. What kind of tone of voice would you use? Would you say, "Hello, are you lost, son? Where's your mother?" I don't think you would. Maybe some of you would, I don't know. But I think there's something slightly eerie about that. Most people, I think, and please correct me if I'm wrong, would adopt a kind of reasonably high-ish, possibly mid, and probably rising tone. Is that true of you?
Yeah.
I mean, is there anybody who wouldn't do that? You'd kind of say, "Hello, is everything okay? Don't worry," that kind of thing. Now, that's what I mean by natural. That's not something that is linguistic. It's not part of English that that's what we do with lost children. You know, you don't find in the Grammar of English page 352 how to talk to lost children. The correct way to talk to a lost child is to use a relatively high key and a rising tone. That's not part of English. That's part of being a human.
Yeah.
That's a natural way for humans to behave. Don't worry, don't cry. You're safe now. We'll find your money. Something like that. It could be quite low sometimes actually, but it would still rise. You know, if you're at school and something bad happens, you know, even if it's quite low and it's somebody who is not necessarily a carer or a parent, they will say, "Don't worry, everything's going to be okay." It's going to be just that little rise. Another example of what I mean is Parentese. Do you all know what Parentese is? Parentese is a kind of, it used to be called motherese, but that wasn't politically correct. So then it became Parentese, and now more recently it's become child-directed speech. It's that most parents, when they talk to their children, adopt a specific kind of key or tone. And typically it's quite high. Okay? Now, people have actually done studies into this, and there is absolutely no evidence that speaking in a high voice helps your child understand language. It's not actually anything to do with language. It's just to do with making them feel safe and making them feel cared for. So that's what I mean by natural. But how? How do we define that? Well, look, let me try and show you. This is a sweet little animal. If you are one of these small animals wandering around the forest floor, you have a small larynx. You go as you forage around for rotting worms and things like that. If you are one of these animals, you have a large larynx. Okay. If you are one of these animals on the left, and you hear one of these animals on the right, how do you feel? Well, believe me, you don't think, "It's okay, gorillas are vegetarians." You think, "I'm going to get away because that's a dangerous sound." Now, that's what I mean by natural. Animals with large larynxes have deep voices. Animals with small larynxes have high voices. What is safer, a small animal or a large animal? These kind of, you know, there are people around at the moment who talk about some elements of intonation in these terms. And actually, I think they're quite interesting things to explore. Because even though we all speak different languages, and we all, to some extent, speak those languages with different intonation patterns and different stress patterns. There are things that are universal about language and about intonation. And one of these things is that, generally speaking, and it's only general because there are always exceptions, higher key, higher pitch is quite positive, and lower pitch is sometimes not so positive. This is very true of English. If you speak consistently in a low key with low level tones, you will find that some English people at least will take that to be you conveying that you're not really interested, or you're not really want to engage with them. So this actually has happened to me several times recently. There are some nationalities who speak in very low registers and very low keys, and if you sit in a restaurant and the waiter approaches you and says, "Are you ready to order?" It's maybe not, you don't feel as enthusiastic about the meal as you would do if you'd heard somebody speaking in a slightly higher key. See you at the pub? Yes, I'll be there. It doesn't really convey anything. Now, this is one from a large personal collection of photos I have. If anybody would like me to show them my database of photos of Margaret Thatcher, I'm very happy to do that. Margaret Thatcher's very interesting because she kind of did the opposite thing. She spoke with a high voice. When she first came to Parliament, she had a really high voice. Nobody took her seriously. So what did she do? She retrained her voice. "Just rejoice at that news," she would say, in her low voice. So I mention this because having spent the last 3 or 4 years banging on at students and saying, look, keep yourself high, keep it in a high key, I had a really worried email from a Japanese student from last year who is doing a project on something that an American English lecturer had told her to do, which was speak in a low voice when you speak English. Don't speak in a high voice. Because if you speak in a low voice, this lecturer had told her, people will think you're more intelligent than if you speak in a high voice. Now, I'm not sure about that. Okay, I don't know about whether you sound more intelligent if you've got a low voice or not. I think perhaps you do. I really don't know, but this is just to show you that there are kind of some cultural variations going on. Jeff talked about the 4 R's and how this is a very nice way of conveying certain attitudes in English and indeed certain levels of affect. Generally speaking, in English, it's quite important to remain non-confrontational and non-aggressive. I mean, that's a huge generalization, but English people do use rises to maintain this kind of non-confrontational attitude. I mean, in the States, if you've been to the United States, it's actually quite different. I went into a bar in Los Angeles a few years ago and said, "Could I have a beer, please?" And the guy looked at me like I was a fool. Because the next person who came in went, "Give me a beer." Now, if I walked into an English pub and said, "Oi, give me a beer," it would be like that. So here's an example of how this goes. 27, somebody says, "The football's on TV at 10. There are 2 ways you can reply. It's not. It's at 9. That's quite confrontational. If we do the rise, it's not. It's at 9. That somehow softens the blow a little bit. Here's another example. "Please be home by 8. This was something I used to say to my daughter years ago. Now I don't, but when I did, she would often say, "Why? My friends stay out till 10. Which is typical of teenage children. The alternative might have been, "Why? My friends stay out till 10. Why? Our friends stay out till 10, which again just kind of softens it a little bit, just makes it a bit more easy to bear. Again, combined with key, attitudes communicated by different tones become even more extensive. So if you say, I hear that George got the job, and you give a rise in a mid or even a high key, so something like a high rise, really? Really? That's positive. Really? That's positive. I hear that George got the job. Really? You haven't really communicated very much. In fact, you possibly sound as if you don't care that George has got the job, or even you wished he hadn't got the job. So saying the same word with a different tone can affect the meaning. This is something, again, that I think we might say is related to the natural side of intonation. So here's a very rough distinction that you can make with English intonation, and particularly English key. The higher it is, there is generally a communication of being more engaged, more positive, more enthusiastic, more happy. Lower tones, forms in particular, often suggest a kind of lack of enthusiasm or lower spirits. So always keep Margaret Thatcher in your mind. Well, perhaps you don't do that. Let me change that. But I mean, remember the example of Thatcher. There is this element that sometimes if you speak in a high voice, people might not take you so seriously. But hey, I'm not even sure I believe that anymore. I'm not sure I believe that. So keeping high or staying a little bit high is a good way to think about English, as well as being a good way to live your life. So, 4 functions we talked about: the grammatical function, the focusing function, the attitudinal function, and the affective function. And I want to finish by just saying a few things. Just a little bit of, a kind of thing to remember. 3 T's: tonicity, tonality, tone. Keep those in your mind when you're speaking. Do what Michael suggests, which is speak in complete IPs. Try and plan your speech to the extent that it's possible to do that consciously, but speak in IPs. Okay, so even if you just have 1 or 2 that you always use, it really does help. And one final thing I want to say, and I think this is really important to remember about intonation, is it doesn't matter if you make a mistake, generally speaking. I try to give this example to some of my Japanese students. So imagine I've gone to Tokyo and I can't speak any Japanese, but I try. Okay? I try to speak some Japanese. And I go up to somebody and I speak and I get it completely wrong. How are they going to respond? Are they going to laugh at me? One person nodded. just as I could feel the warmth and the love in the room. The atmosphere was complete. Nobody's going to laugh at you. Nobody will laugh at you. And if they do, they're an absolute fool. Okay? Using the wrong intonation pattern is never going to be the end of the world. So use them. Try using them. Don't kind of stay like this and never use them. And as well as that, you need to remember that there are a whole range of other behaviours that people use to convey what they mean. So if you really haven't got the right intonation pattern, or you're halfway through your intonation phrase and you've made a complete mess, then just smile. And everything will be okay. Okay? And just one more thing. I knew this would happen. I'm just listening to a few of the responses, because this is so cute. I didn't hear anybody going, oh. Everybody was going, oh. Because it's nice. Okay? So thank you very much. I'll see you tomorrow.